there, Minerva makers. Today I have a video for the Learn to Sew playlist, and today we're looking at the topic of straps and ties and how you make them. Lots of different techniques for you today, and it's a bit of a medley. It's lots of different patterns and fabrics from all different makes, and I've put them together to show you some of my top techniques. It'll depend on what size your strap or tie is for which technique you choose. So if you've got lots in your arsenal, you can choose the best one, the one that doesn't cause you too many problems when you want to turn out your strap or tie. It will take you right from a wide shoulder strap or a wide belt tie right down to creating really small rolly loops. They're all forms of strap or tie, and they'll need to be turned inside out. So there's a few different ways that I can show you to help you get along. First of all, I'm going to show you how to draft a tie. So if you've made a dress or you want to add a tie to a garment to up the fit of it a little bit, or you want to change the ease, you might want to add ties to a pattern that doesn't already have them. So this is how you measure out the widths for a tie so you can make one yourself. For drafting, you'll need to decide on a seam allowance. I've got 1 centimetre. My belt I would like to be 3 centimetres, so I'm going to mark a line for that. Then I need the other side of the belt, so I'm going to mark another 3 centimetre line, and then my other 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm going to repeat that measurement all the way along the fabric so that I get a straight piece, and I'm using my set square to make sure that the fabric is straight along the top. Once you've done all the markings, you can join together all your little dots to get your tie lengths. I'm just double checking at the end there because sometimes it does tail off a little bit at one end. You can use scissors to cut your fabric or a rotary cutter. It depends what you're most comfortable with. Cut out your straps, and I'm making 2, so I need to do the same again. Once I've got the 2 straps, I can now think about how I'm going to construct my ties. They're going to go right sides together. I'm going to think about the finish at the ends. You can finish the ends in lots of different ways. You can have a straight edge, you could have an angled edge. I'll show you a couple of ways. So I'm going to use my seam gauge as a seam allowance there, and the same across the top, and that will give me a square edged tie. If you want an angle on the end, you can use a hot hammer. It's got that 45-degree angle on that's really useful. So I'm just going to leave a little bit of seam allowance and handling room at the end. Line up the bottom of my strap with the bottom of the hot hammer, and then fold on that 45-degree angle. I'm going to give it a finger press just to give me a guideline. And then mark out where my sewing line is going to be. This will give me a 45-degree angle pointed tie. I've allowed a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and when I get to the end, I'm just going to pivot at that angle point. You'll need to remove some of the seam allowance. It depends what fabric you've got. I've got a soft viscose linen here, which is fraying quite a bit. It's nice and soft though, so I'm going to overlock the edges. I love using a tube turner. It's a set that will help you to turn out tubes and straps. It's got 3 sizes in. This is the biggest size, but you put the tube inside your tie, and then you take the stick. It's got a pointy end, which can be a bit sharp sometimes, and a flatter end. So I'm going to use the flatter end with this more open weave fabric. And you reveal the tube at one end and the strap. And because of the shiny plastic surface, the fabric just slips straight off. You can now use the pointy end of the stick to work out the tip of your tie. You do need to be careful because you don't want your stick to pop through the end of your fabric. I'm just using a pin just to pull out that last little corner, but you can spend as much time on that as you wish. The next thing you need to do is to give it all a good press. Once they're pressed, you can top stitch around if you want to add that extra detail. This is pressed really nicely with a lovely drape, so I'm going to leave it as it is. Let's look at how to put it on. Depending on your pattern and its proportions, you might be putting a tie in the bodice, depending on how long the bodice is and where the waistline is, but you'll need to allow the seam allowance underneath. You might be putting your tie in the waist part of the pattern. I've already sewn this seam, so I'm sort of retrofitting here. If you want to do that, you can either pinch together the seam allowances at the back or sew on the top. You can pinch it like that and re-sew this seam if you can get to the very end. If you can't, you can just hold everything down flat and top stitch. If you're retrofitting a tie because you made a garment and you think it would be a better fit with a tie, you can split the side seam either in the bodice or the skirt and put a strap in afterwards. Here you probably will need to be doing top stitching because sometimes it's hard to get to the seam if your garment has already been made. This is what it looks like. I've done the other side. So from the right side there is a little bit of stitching. It blends in, it's a gathered skirt, but the tie is secure. That same style can be used to make a shoulder strap, so you could just make the same draft but a little bit wider if you want to, or a little bit narrower, because in that case you won't see the end of your tie, so they will be just hidden inside your garment. Let's take a look at if you want to have both ends of your tie showing. If you want a tie to go all the way around your waist and you want both ends of the tie to have a really neat finish, then you want to make sure that your turning space is not at the end. So you want it to be at this centre back or to one side where you possibly might work out where you're going to tie the knot. I haven't got a long full belt here, I've just got a shorter piece because I can show it on the screen a little bit easier. So what you'll do for a tie like this is to fold it in half and pin it in place. And you're going to leave a turning space in the centre. Here I like to add 2 pins to remind me to stop sewing. So between these double pins I'm leaving a gap. And I'm going to sew here to the double pin and then here to the double pin. When you use this method, it means that both of your ends will be machine ends, and it's a bit of a short gain really to get yourself a really long straight seam on the sewing machine and think you're going to be really quick and then just fold one of the ends in and hand sew it, because it never looks quite the same as the one that's machine stitched across the end. It also means as well that you can get your really neat corners and do all of your clipping and trimming, which you can't do so easily when you're hand sewing. You sometimes get a bit too much bulk on the inside. So it's a really simple tip really, but turn your double-ended straps and belts from the centre. Where you've got your gap, you can do a couple of different finishes here. So if you've got a busy printed fabric, you can just edge stitch really close to the edge of the fold, or you can hand stitch with a ladder stitch. There's a tutorial for that here. It's a really invisible way of joining up 2 seams that are butted up to each other. It's also ideal if you're making bow features, so if you're making something like a hair accessory and you want to make sure that both of the ends of your bow have a really good finish, then you can make sure that your turning space is inside the knot. It's the perfect technique for dressing gown belts or for adding straps and belts to dresses. If you're using it as a belt, you can also check out our tutorial on how to make thread loops. So if you're retrofitting a belt to a dress, it didn't originally have one, and you want to have a tie belt, but you don't want to lose it or for it to slip and move out of position, here it shows you how to make hand sewn belt loops to secure your belt in place. That's a great technique there if you want to add a belt to a garment. I have made the Victoria blouse and hacked it into a dress, and I changed the waist on there with a tie, and it really did change up the pattern. Let's think about now if we want to make much smaller ties, so moving away from straps a little bit to really thin ties, and that will include some spaghetti straps. If you're needing something really slim for like a button loop, for example, you can sew a straight line down the longest edge. But you need to be aware that however narrow your roller loop is or your button loop is, you can't have too much seam allowance, because if that's too bulky, it won't fit inside your narrow tube. So trim it back. Take a needle and thread that's threaded double with a knot at the end, and just take a couple of stitches through one layer of the strap, and then push your needle through the tube. You need quite a blunt needle, because if you've got a sharp one, it'll keep catching on the fabric. Your needle will pop out the other end. Don't pull it all in one go, just take up the slack and then gently start to pull the ends of the fabric through. Just takes a little bit of starting, but once you get it going, you can just pull gently on the threads to reveal your little tube. Once you can hold the fabric, it's much easier. And that's how you make a button loop. You can also do that for spaghetti straps, but it's quite difficult with a small needle. So let's look at another way. If you have an overlocker, you can make roller loops or really long spaghetti straps that are a similar width. So you cut your fabric and you take a thread chain that's as long as your fabric piece. Once you've got your really long chain, place your fabric under the foot, but with the thread chain running down the centre. Again, another little fiddly thing to get started, but it's fantastic once you get going. And you want to make sure that your thread chain is in the centre. Make sure you cut off the right thread chain. Don't cut the one that was really nice and long, because you're going to use that to pull through your tie. This one works the same as the needle method, but if you've got a fabric that's particularly fraying, it will stop the seam allowance from fraying. You can change that width there on your overlocker if you want to make it even narrower. And now you're going to pull the tail of the overlock chain through the fabric. The thread chain is a little bit stronger than if you use just normal sewing thread double, so you can really pull on this for a long stretch of spaghetti strap. And you can get a really small strap there. That can be used as a spaghetti strap, or you can cut it up into smaller roller loops. That's just a little bit finer than this one. This one's quite bouncy and open inside, whereas this one's got the overlock inside, so it makes a really strong flat shape that's easy to press. So there's two ways to make little roller loops, or if you want to extend, you can use this method to make spaghetti straps. Without an overlocker, you can pull through longer pieces with a really narrow safety pin. One of the things to avoid when you're turning out a strap or tie is to try and turn it out by pulling the fabric over the tie, because there you're expecting this area here to be a wider circumference. It's easier if you push everything inside. If you've got a longer strap and taking a needle through would be a little bit too tricky, you can also use safety pins. If you've got different size safety pins, you can match those up to the width of your tie. Hook the safety pin with plenty of fabric so that you don't rip it, and take your safety pin inside the tie. You just need to do that little bit of working over at the end as before, and then you just keep adjusting the fabric, just like if you were putting a piece of elastic in a casing. All of the straps and ties that I've shown you so far have been turned through the other way, and that's because we want all of these seam to be enclosed on the inside, but that's not always possible if you've got a thicker fabric. This will be the case if you're bag making, for example, and you need to make a bag strap, but you're making it out of a really firm fabric that you can't turn inside out. In this case, you'll need to be making a top stitching strap or tie. So for thicker fabrics, for example here, this is a pleather. So if you were making a handbag strap, and if you put that fabric right sides together and sewed it, it's really difficult to turn it inside out. A couple of reasons: it's thick, it's got a slightly sticky texture, which means it's difficult to pull back through on its own textured right side. So in this case, you'll do a top stitching strap. So you would fold in the seam allowances and then fold them right sides together using clips here now because it's a thicker fabric, and you would create your strap width by folding in the raw edges. This means now that you stitch it from the right side. Your first row of stitching will hold everything together, and then you can do an opposing row of stitching which would give the stitch detail on both sides of the strap. This makes an ideal strap piece, but of course we've got a raw end on each end, so this is fine if, for example, that's going to be your loop and your raw edges will be enclosed within another seam. So for example, if that's your D-ring holder and then you have a swivel clip on there. If you want the ends to be turned in, then you need to use a slightly different technique. If you do want to have exposed neat ends, so for example, having a raw edge and not being able to turn it under is a problem, then you can create a fold on the end, which makes it really neat before you machine sew. So this is how it works. You open out the right seam allowance, keep the left one folded, fold your seam allowance to turn the end under down, fold the raw edge from the right in and the folded edge from the left on top and secure in place. You would then sew all the way down the length of your tie. You can just see here I've got a little bit exposed there. That's not going to make for a very neat end, so if you get one of those, just refold and ensure all of your raw edges and pieces of fabric are on the inside. You can now take this to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to the long open edge. This is an ideal way of making a thin tie. Top stitching, you could stitch the other side as well to get a matching top stitch, but you don't have any of the raw edges showing at the end and everything is folded and enclosed. It's a great way of making your own funky shoelaces. So if you use, I've seen some fantastic Liberty shoelaces made in exactly this way. So a bias strip is cut and folded. You could use a bias tape maker there. And then to ensure that you get nice ends on your shoelaces, you use this folding technique to get two straight ends. Finally, my last little tip is if you are struggling to press your tie, so you're not being able to get that seam really rolled out at the one edge, you can change the tie a little bit. It's not often seen in patterns, but if you have a plain fabric, then you can have the seam line down the centre back of your strap or tie rather than on the edge. That way you get two really neat folded edges, but you do just need to change how you sew the end. This is a sample of gabardine fabric, so it's quite thick and quite bouncy, and it's quite tricky to press because you can't overpress it because it will go shiny on the surface. But if you want to make a strap or tie with this, then I suggest you position the seam on the centre back of the tie. So pin the long ends together, but not the short ends, and take your seam along here. Once you've sewn it, you're then going to take it and press it so that the seam isn't on the edge, it's in the centre. So you can press it open if your strap or tie is wide enough, and when you've done that, we then sew the ends. Depending on the thickness of your fabric, you can now take out some of the seam allowance or some of the fabric on the end, and you could either return to the turning tubes or turn your tube out as you usually do. This now orientates the seam to the wrong side, so from the right side you get a completely flat tie and you won't have to try and deal with the seam turn on the edge in a thick or bouncy fabric. So choose your technique depending on your fabric type. When it's pressed, you'll get really nice edges to your ties, and that seam line on the back will remain completely in the centre, giving you a straight edge at the end and lovely crisp edges. This technique works particularly well if you have a plain colour fabric or a solid colour fabric, and you won't get any of the disguising of that seam line on the edge with a pattern. You want it to look really flat and with a neat finish. Let's take a look at a few pressing tips for making your ties really professional. When you're pressing, you want to try and make sure that that turn of cloth inside there is rolled out. And I try and just damp my fingers or just get a bit of moisture on my fingers because it helps to roll out the seam to its maximum. It ensures that your strap is a consistent width all the way along and you don't see lots of the seam from one side or the other. A poorly pressed seam can reveal some of the fabric from the wrong side, and you could also lose some of the distance. If you're making lots of straps that are the same width and you want to keep that consistent, so for example you're making bridesmaids dresses or a range of costumes, you can use pressing bars. So they are a piece of plastic that fits inside, and when you press it, it keeps the width of the fabric. They come in different sizes, they're by Clover, and they might be worth an explore. If you've got a bouncier fabric like the gabardine, then you really are going to have to roll that seam to the edge, and even then you might not get the desired effect that you want. That's still really springy there, and if you just go ahead and press it quickly, you can end up creating all sorts of trouble where you have the seam rolling to one side and not the other, and you can also change the distance here because so much of the fabric has got folded in towards the seam. In this instance, it's best to fall back on the centre back seam method. I hope today's little mega mix of all different straps and ties will help you. I can't just show you one way because you probably know a different way as well, which would be great if you could share them in comments. But you really need quite a range of ways depending on your fabric type, the width and size of your strap or tie, what equipment you've got, and what finish you want at the end to go on your garment. So hopefully I've given you a few tips. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.